a different one picked out, and my friend Pastor Alex at Prince of Peace was like, "You can't use that," and I was like, "Well, give me a better one." So he's like,
Now we want to know
I was like, it was, a lot of the violence against women texts are, sexual assault in nature, and he's like, "Don't do that the second class." He goes, "Save that to third or fourth." He goes, "Just do sort of, beginning violence, I guess."
Yeah.
Well,
Violence
if
against
you read
women.
the book, it's
Right.
true.
He's like, let's go a little broader. So we'll go a little more seasonal. And we've got sort of a Lenten Good Friday.
There we go.
You know what's a good one is
Riz.
do you know that story? That's a great story with the Alton Church son sign. Yeah.
That's why I was going to use Cannibal Mothers.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, the Terran baby is.
He's like, "Nope, not second session."
Okay, so it's all starting. I think it's going. I'll go look at Facebook to make sure it's working, and then you just need to put end event, and then put it down and pop it in the
Anywhere
office.
in the office.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. Yeah, Jen will know where to put it. Awesome.
Thank you very much.
All right, everyone, behave yourselves.
Okay, good. Well, we wrapped up worship even a little bit earlier than anticipated, but I'm happy to start if you all are, rather than waiting. I don't know.
Please do.
I was gonna say, do we think other folks will probably?
If there were people coming in that didn't attend the service,
We can kind of give them a little bit.
feel like us.
You were just really on top of it.
Well, that's not where I found out how many miles I would say, which was even that many, but not quite two. I have to up the amount because I'm going to Ireland again.
It's gotta be pretty good motivation. I think that would
No,
motivate
not
me.
until September. So I have time. My sister
Get to
who
go on a
sings
fun
there
trip.
at convention at the Community Arts Festival.
Oh.
And
So after last week, I discovered
Right.
the library has like half a dozen antiquarian books.
We have
not-
secure
not
houses.
including for biography.
We're getting there yet, but we have a place to stay once we get there.
Always concerned sometimes when I see what they're thinning out and putting on the book table.
But Clifton,
Not this one, right, exactly. Wait.
I've always
Directly
directly as a
across.
student, that was how I got some of my favorite
Where's
books,
the
right?
West
So libraries
It's
discount.
all about the same level.
But also, did you buy a new copy? Because you should really have a
It's a little
copy of
north
this still on
of
the
Shannon
shelf
and
too.
Galway, but
And sick.
way over where
Yeah, she definitely.
Marconi
I
had
can't
his
remember.
towers to send the
Her
radio.
dissertation, I think it's Love and Saint Augustine or something about Saint Augustine and love. And that's one of her earliest of course, and it's really interesting, I think, and I think she, you see or you read more of her heart in that one. And then as she gets older, it's more academic and more, she's teaching students and trying to explain, but I think that dissertation, you're like, oh, I would be friends with you. And we would talk about theology and it would be great. And then as she gets older, she's like a little more tough. I think.
So how long has she been a prominent figure in like seminary studies?
I think it's actually pretty rare. I got interested in her because she was a personal friend of one of my professors. And so he was like, "Here, this will help you," and just gave me a copy.
I was thinking, I'd say probably the last less than 5 years, I kept seeing more and more references to her.
Yeah.
And, I should pursue that sometime. But
Yeah.
There's always
there's always
some things on like the long list.
Oh, you're
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, I think
There's some look up there.
she's definitely interesting.
We've been waiting for you.
Have you?
Yeah.
I grabbed my Bible and description of it was right on.
It looks
All
like
right.
it's gonna be such a good read. But then you read the first couple pages and
Oh, yeah, perfect for that. Okay. Still don't want to dig in with to-do list. Read a little bit of
If
that.
you're right
last
behind
half
us.
of the copy.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good window of opportunity for.
That's why I sat over here.
I think she's a good one. I feel like somebody we should probably use for a
Or take
but I wonder too if we're sort of getting to a place where there's enough time between
Yeah.
when she was writing and her experience that we're sort of ready to really think about it and sit with some of those ideas again. Because I think a lot of the philosophy critiques of her work were sort of that she wrote too quickly about her experience and too close to the end of the war.
Week.
And
Oh, but it feels eerily timeless right now.
David.
Yes.
David, so Wayne.
sometimes you kind of wish it didn't so much.
Wayne's right, part of it.
Exactly. The timing is just a little too much sometimes. for sure.
Oh,
Oh, is it?
yeah, yeah, or someone else. I don't know
I
who
think
said
for
it.
Good Friday and Easter, but I'm going
As-
forward with this kid.
Yeah, I knew he was gonna go somewhere,
Others,
but I didn't know
how
where.
we're increasing.
He
That's
told
what
them
the
yes, and then he looked at the date. And then he said yes.
Oh,
So
wait.
pretty, yeah, so many of these pieces. And then you start
On
thinking of the
Sunday,
places we see it.
Monday, Thursday, for sure.
And directing. Or rehearsing.
Yeah.
We had gone over it. There's- At
Well,
least
there's
before
one.
Holy Week, there's not a real hot bunch of stuff.
No, but there is.
But there is during Holy Week, yeah, no, I know, but
And
figured I
the,
had a lot of
the
time.
Easter music isn't here yet.
I had a lot of.
So if it isn't here, by next week, he'll change what he's playing right now.
I'm still waiting for the Easter music.
Yeah, well,
The rise.
Supposedly it was shipped.
debating.
It's funny how long that in between time of shipped and not yet here can sometimes take.
Yeah, well,
And sometimes you have a tracker, this case, he doesn't know them, so he doesn't really, probably sitting in Schenectady or something like that.
we are on the end of the shipping routes, you know.
Yeah, our May delivery for our sauna out at camp got there in September.
I believe it, yeah.
So you're talking indoor Easter music or lakeshore Easter music?
Indoor, for the choir. Most of the stuff that we do down on the shore is something that can be done a cappella.
Yeah.
because I don't take my accordion down there
Well, we did get our flowers today. We got this big box. My son likes to send us Christmas, birthday presents of
It was like a-
Hawaiian flowers. So there's
Oh.
this great big thing of 12 big anthuriums that are all like packed.
anymore.
One time they came and they were frozen.
Oh,
So we're always like totally relieved
when I get here,
if we finally get here.
Actually, fresh
In
love.
good shape, we take them out of all these papers that they're wrapped in one at a time.
when,
It's quite fun.
when the kids were confirmed, I got Ethereum for
Did you?
the altar.
Oh, the big red ones, yeah, they're just lovely. These were actually more, there's that big kind of mixed green and pink, you know, kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're kind of a little different, but
And they
kind of fun
lasted
to
a
see.
long time.
Yeah, they last 2 or 3 weeks, yeah.
So probably,
We're gonna have a smaller group than that.
and we didn't feed anybody.
We scared them all off last week.
Oh, they had the community meal and then people stayed for the.
Which is definitely a motivator, right? Most definitely.
Even they will come, that's the.
Right? Exactly. I think we're probably close enough. How are we all this evening?
Cool.
Right, yeah, it is. It's chilly down here. My offer of jumping jacks still stands. If you need to get up, or you could do some like stair loops maybe or something just to warm up a little bit if you need to. All right, so tonight we're gonna do a little bit of biblical interpretation and look at some of these texts a little bit more closely, and then talk a little bit about where we see some of these crowd mentality and mob mentality happening in these readings, and then where we see that in our current context today. And also noting, and we'll get there, that not only is that seen in these violent texts or in these sort of negative situations, but sometimes, right, crowd mentality can be used to our advantage too, right? And so it can have some positive, right, exactly, potentially. We might not always do that so well, but in theory, we can try, right?
Right.
So the next couple slides, if you are interested in a little bit beefier academic terminology and background, enjoy them. If you are not at all interested in that, that is also fine. You can ignore them because it's really not as complicated as some of these will make it seem. So hermeneutics, whether you've ever heard that word before or not, you've definitely done it. So really, these are just a practice of interpretation. This works with our sacred texts. It works with an episode of a show you watch on a streaming service or something like that. If you maybe go walk around an art museum and look at some art, or to the symphony concert and listen to music, the way that you understand yourself experiencing those things, as well as sort of the background. So perhaps when the text was written or when the music was composed, or maybe you know something about the artist. You're looking at a piece of art and you're saying, oh, I know that this person, created this painting right after their marriage ended or something like that. And so all of those sort of context pieces that influence our text or our objects or even our sort of society's thinking or cultural patterns, all of those we can use this interpretation approach to try and learn a little bit more about the text, and then also ourselves as we read this text or listen to this music or any of those pieces. Oh, go ahead, yeah.
Where did the word hermeneutics come from?
Is that Greek?
I was gonna say it's definitely Greek.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, I was like, we're gonna test Katie's Greek, which is a little bit old. I believe it's literally study of interpretation, but I could double check that because it has been a very long time since I've taken classical Greek.
Is Hermes?
Right,
Was
exactly.
he an interpreter? I don't.
That was the day we talked about hermeneutics at my northern class. We also talked about god and goddess archetypes in classical Greece. So we did sort of link it to that. I don't know that there is a link there, but if it helps us remember it, right? It's not totally disconnected for sure. And you will see a lot of different disciplines, academic disciplines or areas of study use this word a little bit differently. Mine, of course, is coming out of this systematic theological and biblical studies focus. So a lot of my work looks at how we have chosen to interpret scripture and what that means now. So whereas a lot of my pastor colleagues, right, they're learning more, marketable is not what I mean, but more like more hands-on skills, right, of sermon writing and pastoring congregation and bedside manner with their CPE things and, all of those pieces. I sort of, my program, we would read the biblical text, but we were much more interested in, say, what Hannah Arendt said about it and how that impacted Christian communities, rather than taking the biblical text and trying to explain it or talk about it in our communities. So it's a little, I'm like sort of one step outside of that sort of piece and seeing how we've chosen to interpret these and then what that means for people of faith, right? How do we take something that biblical scholars and theologians have decided is the correct interpretation, and what does that mean for how we live in the world or how we worship or how we do any of those pieces?
It's interesting to me that hermeneutics, the way you explain that, the meaning of the word, not to be a way with words guy, but It isn't used in many other disciplines. I mean, you could apply that to interpreting the Quran. But I was thinking of in contemporary US society, the Constitution.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
I mean, that's essentially what they're arguing about all the time, about whether that's what, it's the same idea.
Absolutely.
But I've never heard hermeneutics used,
Applied to
Used in that
applied to
context,
that.
yeah.
Yeah, right.
It's true though. That's my day job is one license, and so we deal with music copyright.
Oh,
And so with the pandemic and so many worship services moving online, that has changed how copyright works. And so now it's much more complicated in many ways, because even though churches have different rules than an individual or a secular organization, once you put a service on the internet and it's differently available than when everyone is just sitting in your sanctuary, it impacts copyright. And a lot of our legal representatives and the publishers we work with are starting to they would never call it this, but,
right.
but as I listen to them having these conversations, I'm like, look at that, look at them using this idea to try and figure out what this means. And now, right, and we'll talk about this a little bit too, but there's lots of reasons and good reasons for why we've done something traditionally or in the past that may not be true anymore, right? And it doesn't mean that there was anything wrong with doing them that way before, but now maybe it's time to think about if this still fits our needs or fits our situation. Yeah, absolutely. Language is everything. So here's your heavy academic slide. Again, you can ignore it if you want to. There is no quiz. You will not, we won't do any like flashcards or anything like that to help you remember. But mostly theological focuses and some philosophical focuses are gonna dig into these models of interpretation. So this first one, probably exactly what you would expect, right? It's a traditional approach, very, very focused on doctrine. So if we're looking at a biblical text, we're thinking about how is this usually understood? How do we interpret this or believe this text typically, and like in the history of our belief in this text, what are we supposed to learn from it? Right, so those tend to be the easiest, right? Especially with a couple of passages we'll look at. You've probably heard 10 or 15 sermons on these exact passages, and you're kind of gonna know what you're supposed to understand and take away from the stories. So it's sort of our original wiring, is how a professor explained it to me once. Sort of that original idea that is the tradition we maybe take for granted just because it's so normal to us. This positivist historical exegesis, that's say that 3 times fast, right?
Multiple.
Yep. So this is perhaps a little less easy to fit into a theological or religious piece. This one tends to be really interested in like data or science and really, really focused on fact. The blessing and curse of this one for people of faith, right, is that we all have lived experience and we all have bias, and our biblical text isn't really a data-driven sort of document, right? We're not looking at a bar graph of, sort of, oh, well, these 3 gospel writers said this exact same thing with this exact word. So we aren't approaching it in sort of this mathematical, data-driven way. It doesn't mean that we don't maybe honor certain pieces as fact, or truth, capital T or little t, or any of those things, but it does mean we have to be a little bit careful of, again, our sort of traditional approach and our internal bias and experience, that we're not reading things into a text that maybe aren't there. Other reason that's tricky with scripture, right, is because it's not originally written in English. So, right, there's a lot of steps before it gets to us, right? So the Greek, if you are fluent in Greek and you read a text, you might read something very, very different than the person next to you who's also fluent in Greek, simply because of your lived experience. Or, right, we're human, we have agendas. So if I'm really trying to get you to believe a certain thing, even if I can sort of do that and still be true to what the translation is, I probably will try to a little bit, right? So if I know that there is a prophecy in the Old Testament that would perfectly illustrate the point that I'm trying to make and all of these pieces fit, I'm going to make sure to quote that, just like an academic paper, right? So there is sort of this hope that that we're sharing the full story and backing up the story that we believe in the best ways that we can. Dialogical hermeneutical, another lovely tongue twister. This one's a little bit easier though. So this one is all, like you might guess, dialogical. It's all about our interaction with the text, and then also the original community's interaction with the text. So for example, we know that one of our Gospels is written by a man in the Roman Empire. We know, or we can find out, even if we don't personally know, we can research and find out things about the Roman Empire that will give us an idea of the society that this person was writing in. Maybe, if there are spots, I'm of course blinking on a specific one right now, but there are spots that reference certain pagan holidays or events in the Roman Empire that aren't necessarily connected to Christianity as we know it today, but would have been very important to those early Christian believers. And so knowing that about the person who wrote the text and being able to appreciate and see why they might say things in certain ways, or know, things about family relationships that are really important, or things like that, helps us to understand why they're writing these things and how they're choosing those pieces. In the same way, right, we come to that text with those questions and those connections to our community. If we come in, as active folks at Messiah who believe in the scriptures and consider ourselves Lutherans and all of those things, we probably believe in what we're reading. If we have a Jewish or Muslim sibling who is reading it as an academic text in a class or something like that, they're coming to that text with a different starting point. And so they're going to have a different reading and a different interaction with that same text. So, right, there's sort of that personal bias and lived experience, but also, right, how often do we hear, I'm trying to give a good example, the Palm Sunday triumphal entry into Jerusalem reading that comes up in our lectionary every year, right? Sometimes we replace it with the Passion now, but some version of that we get on that Palm Sunday. I can almost guarantee that the way I heard that as a confirmation student in seventh or eighth grade is very, very different than the way that I would hear it or understand it today, just because of my own lived experience and changes in life and faith journeys and all the pieces. So it sort of depends, right, where you are and what you maybe need or want to get from the text. And then the last one, and this one tends to be more popular with theologians than biblical scholars. Not that biblical scholars aren't interested in liberation, but I think it's easier to take theology and focus on the what do we do with this question. So if our focus is that any theological work we do, any preaching we do, any work we do as people of faith in the church, if the focus is helping the oppressed or standing up for the oppressed or putting more love in the world, right, all of those things, if that's the focus, then that's a lens that we're reading the biblical text with, right? So if the goal is that no matter what we're reading or what we're doing, if the hope is that we are connected with other Christians or connected to our communities or making a difference in the world, all of those pieces, that's also something we want to read into the text. And obviously, right, that looks different for different people and in different contexts. This one also tends to be why some of the really dark, really violent biblical texts, a lot of theologians and pastors and scholars just sort of don't even acknowledge them, right? You won't find them in the lectionary. We don't hear them read as our first or second readings or in the gospel. They don't come up because we've sort of unofficially decided as a Christian community that they don't have value for us anymore, that they're not redeemable because that violence is so counterintuitive to what we're trying to do in these spaces that we just sort of leave those there and don't directly engage them very often, if at all. Which is also a blessing and a curse, right? So is it better not to have the conversation at all or to have hard conversations? Depends, I suppose. All right. Oh, does anyone feel like reading some scripture aloud for us tonight? It's not super long.
Sure, Julia.
I'm gonna do it if it's a dialogue.
There's another one, so you could do the next one if you want.
You can do that.
Then each of them went home, while Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning, he came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and began to teach them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and making her stand before all of them, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. Now, in the law of Moses, commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say?" They said this to test him so that they might have some chance to bring some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." And once again he bent down and wrote on the ground. When they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the elders. And Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus straightened up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, sir." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go your way, and from now on, do not sin again."
Thank you. So thinking about the way that we approach text and a little bit we've talked about, what comes to mind when you hear this?
Where's the man?
For sure, right? Yeah, absolutely.
Not there.
In any context.
That
for
can
now,
change,
right?
hasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, right? Yeah, we can, I think, safely assume she did not commit adultery by herself. So, yeah, absolutely. Where is the man? For sure. Also, maybe where are, the folks accusing her? How do they know? What is, right? Yep, absolutely. What else?
Yeah.
Well, I think what occurs to me is that it's such a interesting way of trying to diffuse the issue. I mean, sort of, or diverge it off from the obvious. You know what I mean? Because that's a challenge. Because he was, it was a trap, and an interesting way of getting out of it.
But I was interested in the fact that he didn't really look at them or at her. That he ended up ignoring them basically, and whatever he was doodling in the
What was he
dirt.
doodling in the dirt? I don't I thought there was going to be something.
I don't think I ever heard that part before.
It's true. I know.
Either.
I'm glad you guys said that too, because when I was finding this, I was like, is this a different translation? But it's the NRSV, so I was like, all right, okay.
What was he doodling in the dirt?
But it's true though, I kind of, it brought to mind sort of, like playground bullies. And my mom, I said, just ignore bad behavior. And so I'm like, all right, this is just ignoring bad behavior over here playing in the dirt.
Yeah.
Fine. But yeah, exactly, right? So just not really engaging. And also, I think a little bit of a gamble, right? I mean, so it's certainly a test, but then also, is anybody gonna just, throw before they think or start this? And then, right, we'll talk about crowd mentality. But there is, a level here of this could have played out a very different way in theory if you had certain personalities or certain, a Pharisee who really wanted to be shown as ideal, right? Or shown as, without sin. Like what happens if that first person throws a rock?
I think it's a buying time, doing something weird that leaves people puzzled rather than immediately taking action.
Yep.
And also at the end, kind of like shuts off a challenge or response, kind of like thinking time. But disorienting thinking time.
It was a bit accusatory too, though, of the others. You know, sort of like, okay, you guys, you think you're so good. Um, it just reminds me of a diversionary tactic that I was reading something in a book today, and it was sort of like the climate change. And the classic issue is, well, what are you doing? If you're a climate activist, then all of a sudden, if you ride on a plane or you eat meat, then people are attacking you see, because you're not being consistent. So it's that classic sort of strike out of, but Jesus did it, so it looked like it was effective too.
Right?
I thought it was kind of interesting that the first people to take off were the elders. It was almost like they were waiting for the crowd to throw the stones, so that they weren't planning to be the people throwing them.
Right. Exactly. Yep. Yes. Hold that thought, because that'll be a really, really good connection to our other one too, right? Yep. Exactly. How do you sort of use what you assume the crowd will do to push forward your purposes? Absolutely. Yeah.
Somehow I keep seeing this as like the headline for upcoming political debates.
Right.
Like, okay, this
Yeah.
is the theme.
Right. Definitely is a theme. Yeah. Yep. So, I mean, this is maybe a little bit tangential, but what do you think the purpose of having a text like this in our biblical canon is? I mean, we have a lot of writings that are from the same time period with a lot of the same concepts or same teachings that didn't make it into our biblical canon. Why did this one stick?
Was this, I don't remember that story from anybody. Is that only in John?
See, and this is where like my theology,
Not so much
can I phone a friend?
Stop, I don't know that either.
I don't know that there's a few stories that about women caught in adultery. It doesn't all connect to stoning.
Oh,
So then there's also the question of whether it's the same woman or the same story. But that is a good question that I cannot answer. But I will check in with some of my biblical scholar friends and let you know.
Well, I only say that because John's purpose of writing stories, I mean, is sometimes a little different than some of the other gospel writers.
Absolutely.
So, I think he was trying to, you'd have to interpret. He was trying to keep everybody pretty humble about being fast to accuse other people of sins when they may be doing the same thing in another form.
Really, really good point. John tends to really preference the divine side of Jesus more so than the human side, and more so than sort of it being an even split. So yeah, absolutely. This is, I would say this is one of the few stories in John that doesn't, I don't know, not that Jesus doesn't seem divine in this story, but maybe where it's a little more human, just in that, right, than some of the other places. Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. We are talking about the word, but also he is still playing in the dirt. So we do have sort of this human connection, right? So there's that piece for sure. Yeah.
I guess it's in there because it says we're all sinful, and that everybody admits it by walking away. And so I think it's basically saying we're all in the same view of God's grace, no matter what.
Yeah, I like that. Great connection.
And then the go and sin no more, that he says to her, which we know is an impossible direction.
Right. At least maybe not in the same way. We just
I
have
think it
hope
was
for,
referring to the same.
hope for something different, right?
Maybe that's the only way she could eat.
Well, it might be, I know.
I don't know why, there's no background. You don't know. And you don't know how in the heck did they know that in fact she was peeping people.
Right?
We don't know
Right.
much about it.
But also, I just come to the fact that here they are, they bring her there and they said she was caught. We all know. Well, how do you know? Where were you that you saw this whole thing?
Nope.
And why were you looking?
And telling everybody else.
Right, exactly. Why was this the conversation? Yep. And that's, I of course couldn't tell you which gospel it is, but one of the other stories where Jesus is talking to a woman and mentions, the man you live with isn't your husband.
That's a good Samaritan.
Right, yep, oh yeah, yep. And, so I mean, there's certainly sort of this cultural, I mean, like you said, right? Maybe she needed to eat, right? There is sort of this cultural understanding in the Roman Empire and in early Christianity, right? Where women are not individual citizens or persons with power or decision or choice or any of those things in that context. So trying to sort of weed through what that means and how then we interpret a story like this is a little bit different than how we might have a conversation about adultery today. Might be similarities too, but hopefully some differences.
They might, I'm looking at the people who brought her, the elders and all. They didn't work the crowd up enough. And when I'm thinking of mob mentality, that
Yep.
happens now.
Yeah.
But no matter how we get it, they have done some homework and worked up crowds before they get into the situation.
Nope.
Well, they didn't have instant media to do it, and they couldn't ping them on their phone, but.
Now I'm like imagining, church elders with access to social media. Yikes.
Whoa.
So what was their goal? Was their goal to have her stoned, or was it goal to get Jesus? Trap.
Right.
I think they probably take advantage.
It might be a little too soon, but 2 birds with 1 stone, right? Like, yeah, absolutely, right? How can we, right? We have so many stories of elders and scholars and rabbis trying to trick Jesus, right? And it never works out the way that they think it will. But yeah, absolutely.
But this is an example of his response not being one that they can challenge,
Right.
even though he's challenging them. And issuing what my kids would call an aspirational goal. That yes, everyone makes mistakes, but there are still standards. Is their interpretation of we're all sinners and issuing possible.
Doing our best, yeah. Yep. I like that aspirational goals. Well, since that links us to our crowd mentality piece, let's talk about that a little bit. So as we already talked a little bit about last week, and you all, I'm sure, are familiar with, we have a tendency when we're in groups to default to whatever behavior or action or words are being used by what we perceive as the majority of that group, right? So we talk sometimes about the loud minority becoming the majority because they're the ones that we notice or that we hear. And part of that is this sort of human desire to mirror or imitate the person or the action or the words that seem correct in that moment. And sometimes that might be our own sort of safety preset, right? So if I'm in a group of people and it seems like a lot of folks are angry, maybe out of protest or at something where emotions are very, very high and people seem very angry, it's much more likely that other individuals that perhaps wouldn't behave in those ways, just walking down the street alone, now might mirror that either because they want to sort of maintain their own safety and not be picked out of the crowd, right? So if you sort of match the behavior or mirror the behavior of people around you, you're less likely to be picked out as an individual. But also, right, we have a tendency to want to join and want to present in the way that seems correct to us in that moment. So we're really likely to imitate whatever behavior seems like the correct one in that moment. I went to a lecture once where, I can't remember what it was. I think she pulled on her ear. And it was about this, but we didn't know it was about the crowd and herd mentality. And I kind of did notice that, you know, every once in a while as she was talking, she'd sort of just like do something with this earring. And pretty soon I noticed I started to do something with my earring. And then I started to notice that a bunch of people around me who didn't even have earrings were doing something, you know, and it was like the strangest experience. And then finally, I suppose she was watching and enough of us had our hand up right at that same moment that she was like, freeze. And she goes, what are you doing? She goes, why are you doing it? Because I was doing it. And it's a very strange realization, right? To have that you don't even think about the fact that you're listening to what they're saying and you're just starting to mimic their behavior or their body language. One of the big things, we did a customer service sort of training at my day job workplace. And the speaker talked a lot about matching the energy, which is a little bit terrifying when you think of customer service situations sometimes, right? I'm like, if it's positive energy, sure. But if it's negative energy, I don't know that we want to match that, but okay. But it really is interesting. And I, have tried it occasionally just to see what would happen. But if you say, go to Starbucks, and maybe the person isn't unfriendly or anything, but they're maybe like a little low energy, or they're not super talkative, or they don't make eye contact, and you go a little over the top for your normal, and you start to really make eye contact, and how are you? Are you having a good day? It really does, there are occasions where it doesn't work, and then I'm just the perky, annoying person. I'm sure that they're very glad when they leave, but most of the time, they'll sort of come out of it, and they'll match that energy. So try it. Just see what happens and see what kind of experiences you have. But we do, right? We want to be accepted, and we want to feel like we're fitting into community, and we're really well socially conditioned, right? We want to feel like we're doing the things we're supposed to be doing. We're matching those social cues. All of those things make us feel safe, make us feel like we're succeeding, and we're so good at it that a lot of the time we don't even notice that we're doing it. Even like, oh no, I think you guys moved. There was a moment where all four of you had your legs crossed the same way. So you're the trendsetter. You shook them out of that. But right, so like even that, right? There's just things that we'll see somebody else shift, and then we'll say, oh, I'm kind of uncomfortable, I'm gonna shift too. Right? So just all of those
I was gonna make a comment that, in addition to what you're saying, mirroring and imitation, I think that crowd mentality, there's also a tendency to want better.
Yeah.
If people are at all competitive, they want to, they got permission to do this, and then they want to even impress people to do something, that same thing. And the one that comes to mind was just, January 11th.
Yeah,
6th, rather, yeah, 1/6, yeah. I think that's part of what people got caught up in.
I think that is a reasonable, it starts.
The hardest thing is to drop out.
Absolutely.
It's like, this is what thing. And just
Absolutely.
leave.
How do you,
There are probably a few that do that.
right.
We
But
don't know.
it's true, once you sort of get into that place and then you're in that, heightened emotional response, it's super hard to turn it off and shift, right? Absolutely.
I think the same issue is there for people who are watching the big crowd. And so you see, the loudest chant that most of the people are doing, and you no longer pick out people who are more individual or quieter in their response, that the whole group takes on the characteristics of the loudest, most energetic.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
It's like the student section
Same
at
thing.
MU hockey games, right?
Mhm.
You have sort of this very loud, maybe the pep band and that student section that's next to it, they're starting the cheers, they're starting the wave, they're, right, everything's coming out of that section. It doesn't mean there's not students in other parts of the, the arena, or that maybe there are individuals in our other sections who are just as loud and excited. But it's true, we sort of have this, and then I'm also sure there are students in that section that are sitting down and not cheering and not participating, but I never see them. Yep, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And in all of those same ways, right, having that majority group believe something or take action or do something can impact our individual beliefs or actions, not only in that moment, but long term, right? So, I mean, right, to use the January 6th as an example, there are probably people who, watch that on TV and never would have considered that, I mean, I know I never would have considered that I would be sitting in my house in Market, Michigan, watching this happen at our Capitol, right? And then that, one way or the other, right, impacts our actions and our beliefs and what we do now because of watching or potentially participating if you were there in person at that time, or something like that, right? So it can influence not only those actions and words and movement in that moment, but also long term, a lot of that ripple effect.
I think there's a lot of evidence to say that actually when people move to different parts of the country, like all of a sudden we move into Texas, in a conservative part of Texas, we're more likely to become Republican and change some of your political beliefs. No, I mean, just because you're surrounded by everybody. There's been a number of studies that I think have shown that is quite interesting.
That's true. It really is. I mean, it's so I mostly paid my way through grad school by being a church musician. And some of the time it was at ELCA churches, and some of the time it was at Missouri Synod churches or Catholic parishes, or whoever wanted to hire me to be their music director.
There
That
you
would be
go.
great. And because I had a theology background, they were sort of okay with the denominational piece, because it was like, all right, I at least know where my beliefs are different than yours, so I can make that work. But, I mean, the Missouri Synod Church, I think I served there for almost 3 years. And I look back now at papers that I wrote during that time, and they're a much more conservative viewpoint than what I wrote the years I was working for a Methodist congregation. And it's still a spectrum, right? Because I'm like, really, at the core, I was still considering myself ELCA Lutheran and going to services there when I was going to worship. But it's true, there's something to be said for the more you're exposed to something and the more you're hearing certain viewpoints or understandings, the more that starts to make sense. And you start to sort of justify it or integrate it into your thinking and say, oh, that's kind of a good point that I have to bring in. It's really interesting. Most of the students in my honors class at Northern this semester are freshmen, and we're only this is spring break, so last week was week 7, so we're about halfway through. But even just watching their discussions across that 7 weeks has been so interesting, because there's 7 more weeks into getting to know roommates better, or maybe they have a new roommate because somebody transferred, or these pieces, and they're starting to understand that maybe they don't believe exactly what their family of origin believed, or maybe there's they have a belief that they thought was pretty ingrained and pretty set, and now they're challenged because they're learning new information in the classes they're taking or from their peers, and now all of a sudden here's this belief that I have, and now I have this new information, and how do I reconcile those two things? Maybe that learning or that conversation now impacts what that belief looks like. Maybe it doesn't, but maybe it does. Or maybe I have to do more research or think about it more, or do a little more living as I process that, right? And see what that ends up looking like. Yeah, go ahead.
So social media amplifies whatever set of beliefs that you kind of tend toward. So is that having a big effect, do you think, on this?
I think so.
I think-
Yeah, I think so. And I think too, somebody said we know things so quickly, right? And we can share videos and see, people in action in all these ways. And it's sort of, I feel like it's one of the like coolest things in the world, and probably also one of the worst, that we have access to so many things, right? Exactly. Because we don't take that moment to breathe, right? And like think before we share, or all those pieces. Yeah. And I think too, right? Like I think I said last week, helping students try to navigate, we're bombarded by so many viewpoints, and there's personal blogs from folks that are just sharing their own personal thoughts. And then there are, scholarly articles that have been reviewed by panels of people who've studied things for years, and everything in between. And so how, it's strange for me. So I was raised in rural Wisconsin. I think we had dial-up like the whole time I lived at home. And my first cell phone was, I think, when I got my license, and it was like the brick track phones that had the pre-set minutes, and it was like only for emergencies. So these students that have always had access to a smartphone have always had, the entire world of research and media and access literally in their pocket is mind-blowing to me. And it's exciting because, right, they can, in theory, they can learn anything they want in a second with a Google search. But
they don't look at what is the real background? Is this true?
Right.
Is it true?
exactly. And so
That's
how do
amazing.
how do we teach them to, and remember ourselves too, right? That, okay, I'm seeing this article, but where did it come from? Who wrote it? Is it a response to something else? Is this the only person who has written on this side of things? Should I be looking at other viewpoints, right? So there are all of these complicated pieces that we have to try and keep remembering and figuring out how to navigate. I think it's really overwhelming.
I don't think they always learn from it either, though.
Right.
They just like, oh, well, then the next time they just look it up again. But if they can, but they don't really
Like
integrate
retain it, yeah.
the information and retain it. Because there's no need to, because you always get
It's always
back to
there.
this. It's always there.
It's embarrassing how much I use my calculator. I used to be able to do math in my head.
Not anymore.
Not unless it's like pretty
Real
basic. But no, right? Because why? Why would I need to retain any of that information? I have a pocket computer. Always fine.
Right.
Right?
A bystander.
Exactly, right. So very similar to our crowd or mob mentality, right? That bystander effect. The more of us that are in a group, or the more of us that are watching each other or could be watching each other, the less likely any one of us is going to take an action. And part of that is sort of this idea of diffusion of responsibility. If there are a bunch of us around, probably someone else will jump in. So I don't have to. Because for example, if I maybe feel a little unsafe with whatever the situation is because I'm a woman, there are men here, so one of them will handle it because they're safer than me. So we'll, I can take the pressure off myself and say that someone else will do it, someone else. And then maybe if someone else starts it, maybe then I feel like I can also jump in and help. But somebody's got to be the first one. And the more of us gathered in the space, the less likely any one of us will decide to be that one. And then social influence, pretty similar, right? We're watching the other people that we're around to see what they're going to do and to see what our response should be. So this falls back into that mirroring a little bit, but also just sort of context clues or social cues, right? So you're kind of trying to figure out what happens. And this can be little silly, easy things, right? Maybe you're at a really fancy restaurant and there's you know, 3 different glasses and one's water and one's wine and one is something else and there's all these extra forks. Maybe you're just looking, you know, for the person around you, yeah, which fork am I supposed to be using? Like, is that a water or a finger bowl, right? So, I mean, there's sort of this, these sort of like neutral ways that we watch each other. Or even, right, if you're going out to dinner with a friend and you try to get them to order first so that you see if they're doing salad or a burger tonight, right? Like, which night is it? Are we healthy salad people tonight, or are we burger people? And making sure that we're matching whatever that energy is to make sure that we're all feeling comfortable. In theory, and I guess all of this is theoretical, but in theory, right, we can also utilize this in ways that are good too, right? So it's sort of a backwards peer pressure, I guess, right? But if we see people behaving in positive ways and we notice that they're watching us to see what we're going to do, we're more likely to do the correct thing because we think we're being watched, and people might think less of us if we don't do the right thing. So sometimes we can sort of use this collectively to our advantage. And again, if you can get one person to sort of start the wave, it's a whole lot easier for other people to follow that action and jump on board. Yeah, go ahead.
Whenever we play a gig someplace, we always put a tip jar out. We always seed it with some money.
Oh, yeah.
So that somebody thinks, well, I guess they're tipping them, so.
Yep, exactly. It's true though, right? Like, this is, yeah, it makes sense. That's what I always, and you always notice too when folks will, like, if one person does a tip, then all of a sudden, like, a couple trickle in, right? So it's sort of this, like, but even, right, when we do, communion or anything, right? Like, if there are folks that are new, maybe they're Lutheran, maybe they've done, had communion 100 times, but if they can watch and follow and do what the people do, right? It's much easier than trying to have to be that first person and jump into it if you're not sure how you're supposed to be.
Don't sit in the front row.
Exactly. Look,
Nobody does.
Just see. You're safe that long, just, But yeah, exactly. So all of those pieces. The other thing, right, our culture, especially United States culture, tends to take advantage of this a little bit in the way that we structure society and the way that we expect things. So for example, I'm sure most of us have been driving down the highway and you see one of those signs that says speed monitored by aircraft. All of a sudden you are probably much more aware of the speed that you were going, or if you, I used to live in Chicago, so that stretch of 6-lane coming like up through toward Kenosha, and I've never seen a cop actually pull someone over, but they sit in those turnarounds, right? And I've never seen them actually move, but boy, you watch the brake lights, right? So like the second that we see that cop car, it's like, oh, whoops, I was right. So they don't even have to ticket anyone necessarily, just the presence and like the possibility that we're doing something out of line or that isn't socially acceptable. And we might get caught, because that's the other piece of it too, right? It's the like possibility of being caught. Then all of a sudden we change that behavior, and all the cars behind us do too, whether they want to or not, because we have that whole lineup then.
And it could be an empty car or a car with a dummy.
Right, exactly.
There is an empty
They do that
car.
nowadays.
I'm coming in from 41 Candy Lane.
Definitely have minor panic attacks when I drive fast enough to realize someone in that car. It's always there. Yep, exactly.
I think the guy lives in that.
I was gonna say, it's like, I think it's just usually parked there. Every time. Yep. But so all of those pieces and all of those things that we might not even necessarily think about, but these are, they're built into our psyche and the way that we understand the world without even thinking about it.
I love the elementary school training that kids get these days about anti-bullying strategies, and it's a very positive impact of this. It's just kids forming clusters and surrounding kids who are getting picked on, and go just in twos though to confront someone who's bullying, and say they can join their group and protect everybody, or they'll have to play by themselves for a while, or, but checking back of giving repeated opportunities for people to kind of come in and join the group. But the peer pressure to be part of the defenders rather than the attackers is powerful.
I love that. Yeah,
That's great.
it's true. Yeah, I have 3 nieces and a nephew, and it's fun. One, 2 of them are like older than 10 now, so starting to have more advanced conversations and making those connections and things. And I mean, we're all human, but I feel like we're on a good place. We're doing right, like we're doing really well with those pieces, and having them learn how to work better in community and have those conversations and all those pieces, and it just makes me really happy.
Or maybe it's an example of where our attention is focused on the things we want to see happen
And
and
change
not
that.
paying attention to other things that need attention.
Right, also that, yeah. Totally fair.
I'm saying that about myself.
I know, you can say it about me too, honestly, because I know I very much resonate with that, for sure. All right, so I promised you a Lenten reading. This one is a little longer. Anyone don't mind? You can pick it up. This one is you probably guessed what I said. Good Friday, which one we're looking at next.
Now, at the festival of the governor, the governor was accustomed to releasing a prisoner for the crowd, anyone whom they wanted. At that time, they had a notorious prisoner called Jesus Barabbas. So after they had gathered, Pilate said to them, "Who do you want me to release to you, Jesus Barabbas or Jesus who is called the Messiah?" For he realized that it was out of jealousy that they had handed him over. When he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, "Have nothing to do with that innocent man, for today I have suffered a great deal because of a dream about him." Now the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas and have Jesus killed. The governor again said to them, "Which of the 2 do you want me to release to you?" And they said, "Barabbas." Pilate said to them, "Then what should I do with Jesus who is called the Messiah?" And all of them said, "Let him be crucified." Then he asked, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted the more, "Let him be crucified." So when Pilate saw that he could do nothing, but rather than that a riot was beginning, he took some water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourself." Then the people as a whole answered, "His blood be on us and on our children." So he released Barabbas for them. And after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified.
So this one, right, we didn't use social media, but we do have our leaders intentionally playing this crowd card. There we go. So yeah, what else did you notice about this one? Could be similar to the other one or totally different. The right answer.
They were successful this time.
Yeah, absolutely. They got the crowd to do what they hoped it would do.
And the people even went so far to say, "Hey, yeah, we know we're to blame. So
Let it be on
let it be us.
Yep.
Be us." And that Pilate really wasn't very strong. His wife came out and said, "Hey, look at here."
Remember that story about the
What
white
do you remember?
dude?
That one gets underplayed a little bit. You don't always hear about the wife's dream.
Yeah, that she was warning him that this was not a good decision. So he already knew it wasn't a good decision.
Right. It was trying not to do it, but now he wanted to be able to go home and not have any concerns. So he's got to make sure he's guilt-free, right?
Yeah, but he can't be because at home he's gonna get it from his wife.
Exactly.
He's really in a hard place.
So women did have some power back in those days.
Well, there you go.
Yes, right. That would be your liberation-focused feminist take on the text right there. Yep, exactly, right? So, yeah. And also, right, this sort of, a lot of times, especially in the Old Testament text, we talk about dreams really as being prophecy. A lot of women have them, right? And we don't talk about that a lot, but that, in a lot of the, those cases, we have a woman who's having a vision or a dream, and we, don't talk about them as prophecies, but boy, was she right. So, yeah. Right? Yeah, what does a text like this tell us about humanity, or sort of this crowd mentality?
It can be manipulated, that was the thing that it was.
Sure sounds like it.
Yeah.
And in theory, I mean, granted, we only get sort of this little snapshot, but it didn't seem real difficult, right? And if we think that just, a week, but biblical time frame, but a week before, right, we had this triumphant entry into Jerusalem where the crowd behaves kind of in the same way, but in excitement of welcoming Jesus, right? And putting coats down for the donkey to walk across, and all of these sort of this joyous entrance where we're all really excited and we're celebrating this person. And then fairly shortly after, right, we completely turn and can, have this entirely new viewpoint.
I've often wondered if there were two groups. There was the group that is excited and then there's this other group who's saying, now wait a minute, we really don't want him to be, and so we have to do something because that we are losing power if he's there. So there were, I really thought there were Republicans and Democrats. Two separate groups.
But right, yeah, exactly. And I was talking with my friend Pastor Alex about some of these texts, and one of the things that he said, he goes, we assume that all the people who eventually are going to be at the cross were probably also part of this crowd. And so when we think about crowd mentality and where are the followers who know they're not safe in this angry crowd, and this, depending on the gospel, right, this is also the part where they sort of back off a little bit. And so we think about, you have maybe this, they could have even been the majority in theory, right? But the minority and the angry crowd and the folks that are being, our understanding of it, are being manipulated to behave in this way and to ask for this outcome, right? Who wasn't safe in that situation, and so who had to back away, or who wasn't, able to start a chant the other direction, or right. So there's also sort of this, how do we think about these situations, like a lot of the ones we've talked about, right, where we watch it or we hear about it and it seems like everyone is believing this thing. They probably weren't. They were just the loud ones, right? So there's sort of this
squeaky wheel thing.
Yeah.
We even have that saying.
Right, exactly. But yeah, exactly, right? Like the louder and sometimes more, not more ridiculous, but like more provocative, right? You can be, or like the more extreme in one way or another, the easier it is to sort of manipulate and get things to that level.
And this is a holiday with the tradition
Right,
of
exactly, with the
pardoning somebody, and you pardon the person that feels like a little more of the type of person you typically pardon, or do you pardon the one that's really like odd and hard to understand? And
Right, exactly. And then that sort of goes back to our power conversations, right? If we have a Roman Empire, and particularly these religious leaders who are so sure that Jesus and Jesus's followers are threatening their control and their power of this situation, They will do almost anything to make that problem go away, right?
But they were looking to the Romans to be able to execute this, and they didn't approve of the Romans. They didn't want the Romans there, and yet now they're using the Romans.
Well,
Sort of like twofold manipulation, right? Like
typical.
turn the crowd and then, yep, exactly. How do we use the government to our advantage? Yep.
I read a book called The Social Animal, and it was kind of scary to read the book because it pointed out how, we always think, wow, that wouldn't be that person.
Oh.
But when they put people in experiments, they are that person. Any one of us would probably get sucked into that kind of a mentality. Maybe not quite that extreme, but do something you wouldn't do normally. Do you think you wouldn't do now?
It's true, they really are that original wiring.
Circumstances, you
Yeah.
can.
It's really, yep. Well, it's also interesting, so a lot of my dissertation and background was related to the atonement theories that we talked about, but specifically how Christianity has sometimes used those atonement theories to almost justify domestic violence. And sort of this idea of, you stay in that relationship because it's your cross to bear, or something about this suffering will be redemptive in some way, right? So it's sort of in that vein of things. And so that gets really complicated really quickly, right? When, that may or may not be how, hopefully, right, we're not interpreting scripture and theology that way now, but how we interpret it or how we preach about it is very different sometimes than what a person living that situation hears, right? So there's also sort of this twofold, the things that we say or do or profess belief in, even if we feel like we're really great at communicating, that isn't always what the other person is hearing. And so then, we think, and then I think too, right? Yeah, we think that this would not be a thing that I would ever do or a thing that I would even ever believe maybe. And then all of a sudden when the setting is right and that lived experience piece is there, a lot of scholars will actually tie in some of this with like trauma responses. So the fight, flight, or freeze responses. And so sometimes, they'll look at things and say that someone who has a tendency to freeze when they're triggered by past trauma is going to be less likely to, take action in one of those group situations or one of those crowd situations, whereas someone who maybe is more likely to flee because of their background trauma, they, depending on the situation, they might actually be that person to start an action. So there's also sort of all this original programming that we all have based on, all of those pieces. And it's true, you can't always be 100% sure how we'll react in every situation. And there are times we just don't know till we're in that moment.
And there are groups that look at these things differently. Like you said, as far as that atonement business there, that there are people in the pulpit who are hanging there.
Yep, it's true, right?
That's your cross to bear.
Yeah, I keep thinking of how badly we treated divorcees. Not the men so much, but for years, the women who were divorced, they have the kids, they don't have any money to take care of it, and yet still, and for
You
years
treat
and
them like
years.
a widow.
No, not like that.
Yeah, exactly. No, not in health ways, right?
I'd like to look at it through, what was the guy who said, I wash my hands of this?
Oh, Pilate.
Pilate.
Yep.
What would happen if Pilate said, the other way around, let's release Jesus? So I got a message that, that's a message for people who are in leadership to make the right decision. And he made a wrong decision. And yet, God knew that he was going to say what he was saying, but that's an example of if you're confronted by a crowd, to make the right decision. If you're a leader or something like that, and he didn't.
Yep, yeah, that's a really great point, really, really powerful point, absolutely, right? And also, right, we rely on our elected officials or government leaders
Well,
to
sure.
be able to make those choices above that mob mentality. Absolutely, yeah, that's a really, really good point. Yep.
There are lots of examples of people who've acquired a lot of power with their non-violent responses to intolerable violent situations. It's Gandhi, the King.
I bet there are more that have gotten power by violence. than there-
At least for
I think we know them, like Gandhi and people like that.
True, like that, but just how many?
Okay, but
It's a list for
It's
sure.
violent, but being power, unfortunately.
Yeah, and they respond to the non-violent people pretty.
Violently.
Right.
Right. Exactly,
Yeah,
yeah.
Martin Luther King getting a shot, we got it, shot too, yeah.
Exactly, right? It's easy to fall back on violence, right? Or, I mean, human history would suggest that it's easy to fall back on violence. However we feel about that ethically or morally is a different conversation, but that tends to be our sort of gut reaction to things, for sure.
That's the fight part. We talk about the other, you know.
Exactly.
We have a
Literally
tough
come
time
us-
learning.
Yeah,
Do
Really?
you think looking at this 2,000 years, you think there would have been enough people that picked up, these are things that maybe aren't appropriate and that we should change our belief system, our foundational belief system and make some of those moves. And we're still perhaps promoting that, but so often the others come through.
it's true, right? Sort of there's nothing new under the sun. We just really like to learn lessons over and over and over. Or maybe not really learn. Maybe we didn't retain, information. Other thoughts or questions about any of the things we've dug into tonight, or other, related things, or anything like that?
Well, we still need to look more where God is in all this.
Yeah.
Because right now, it's been, okay, the fruit was the violence and thinking of the title.
Yeah, exactly. We got our power and violence. Yep, exactly.
Power.
Right. We at least got a little like God in the person of Jesus tonight, but it's true. We haven't
But he was killed, you know.
Exactly. It's not looking great. Right? Yeah, yep, absolutely. Yeah. And I think too, right, thinking about even just with these two texts, I mean, obviously God in the person of Christ, right, is in the text literally, but also, I mean, where do we see God in these texts, or how do we sort of try to reconcile that?
We have 2 more classes.
I was gonna say, spoiler, that's where we're going, so.
Right, that's where we're going, yeah, right, there you go.
But yeah, it's true. I think it's interesting how often, so obviously, right, we have a very expansive Lutheran understanding of the Trinity and the 3 in 1 and all of those pieces. But I do think it's so often, especially in our New Testament text, right, when it's really stories and parables and miracles of Jesus and of this portion of that 3 in 1. And I think sometimes, the tendency is to sort of forget about the other pieces of that, right? So thinking about sort of the Holy Spirit piece and the God the Father piece and how that all plays together, especially when, like in this Matthew reading, the divinity piece of Jesus isn't really, we don't really talk about that. I mean, he's literally about to be beaten and crucified, right? So they're not highlighting that divinity part, right? Because that's not the part that they're trying to get us to focus on right in that moment. So starting to try and think about, we know there's violence. We know that God is in these sacred scriptures. And now how do we sort of put all that together and move us to a place in the here and now where it is helpful to us?
So does it look all different if you stretch out the time frame, so in a God sense of time rather than our own?
Really good question. Yeah, I mean, I think that certainly makes sense that it would. I haven't really thought about it quite like that before, but yeah, certainly makes sense that it would. And I think too, right, we look at sort of so the beginnings of Christianity sort of lining up with that Roman Empire. And then even the gods and goddesses and religious practices in like early Greek society or leading into that Roman Empire, there's so many points of connection and so many pieces where early Christians were able to sort of take things that already made sense and pull that understanding and the things that they were raised with or grew up with into how they understand the person of Christ and God as a larger concept and all of those things. And so I think thinking about not only God in terms of our understanding of Christianity as being a finite time period, but sort of that more expansive idea. I like that. I think about that one.
The idea that because the reason they could expand as far as they were wasn't because the Roman Empire was there and had built roads and was keeping some sort of peace, that they weren't murdered by the neighboring tribe when they walked out.
It's true though, yeah. There's been a lot of those moments, right, in history where it's like, man, this really could have played out differently had just a couple things happened. I had a professor in undergrad who, because it was a Reformation theology course maybe, and talked a lot about how, really Martin Luther, it was kind of a right place, right time. I mean, he was this very obscure little monk in a rural community. And, the Catholic Church wasn't crazy about what he was writing, but also he was an obscure little monk in a rural community. So we don't need to worry about him. We don't need to, right? And like, hello mainline Protestantism. So we didn't do that. Yeah, we might have underestimated that obscure little monk. So.
But it was coming around again because other people had said it before, and they had gotten
Yeah, exactly.
under crucified.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Yep. So it really is like that sort of perfect storm time and place to make things click and work. Yes. Well, I hope you all have a lovely rest of your Wednesday evening. Thank you for being here, and we'll see you next week, hopefully.
Okay,
Thank you all so much.
thank you.
At least it's not so.
Yeah.
At least it's not so.
Right, I was gonna say, I don't have to clean off my truck with however many inches of snow we had last week this time.